Well, hello, everyone. I'm Tyler Chrestman, and welcome to the Chrestman Conversation. Today on the podcast, we're going to be talking about this horrific attack that happened yesterday on author Salman Rushdie. It seems like it's been a while since we've had to talk about the problem of Islamic extremism, but we're going to dive into it a little bit today. For those of you who haven't seen the news, yesterday, August 12th, Salman Rushdie was supposed to give a talk in New York that was billed as a discussion of the United States as an asylum for writers and other artists in exile and as a home for freedom of creative expression. He came out on stage at around 10:45 in the morning, and then an assassin, or would-be assassin, rushed the stage and stabbed him multiple times before being subdued. According to reports that have come out so far, Rushdie was stabbed multiple times in the neck and abdomen. He was airlifted to a hospital where he underwent emergency surgery. As of this moment, he remains on a ventilator. He's unable to speak, but his spokesperson said that he has liver damage and he might wind up losing an eye. So, very sad news from yesterday. Salman Rushdie is a personal hero of mine. He has been a champion of Western liberal values for a very long time and is probably one of the foremost pillars and symbols of free speech in the Western world. I had the opportunity to see him lecture twice. An opera based on his book, Shalimar the Clown, opened. World premiere was here in St. Louis, so he came and did a talk with the person who wrote the music and lyrics for the opera here in St. Louis, and that was very cool. And then he also gave a talk here when he was on a book tour for the Golden House. That night was actually one of the most important nights of my entire life, for personal reasons, don't ask. And I actually had the opportunity to ask him a question about freedom of speech, funnily enough, that he knocked out of the park with his answer. So it is very sad to see him be assaulted this way, and we wish him a speedy recovery, obviously. Why is Salman Rushdie important? Why is this man the person that he is today? Why do we know his name? Why is he an important figure in literary history? He's a great writer, first of all, but that is actually, he's going to be overshadowed by the controversy that he brought into this world with one of his books that will always be what he is probably known for. He's written 24, 25 books at this point, but the thing that people will refer to him as is the author of the Satanic Verses. There was a gigantic controversy when this book came out. The Satanic Verses is a book. For those of you who've never read Salman Rushdie, he uses something called magical realism in his novels. They are kind of sometimes hard to describe exactly what they're about, so I'm not going to attempt to do it with this book, but I will talk about what the controversial elements are about. There's a subplot in the book about the life of the Prophet Muhammad, and it centers around the Satanic Verses, which are these group of verses that were supposed to appear in the story is that basically Muhammad had a revelation. There were these verses that were going to originally go in the Quran about these pagan gods you were also allowed to pray to, which basically blows apart the idea of monotheism. And then later, Muhammad recanted these and took them out of the Quran because he said that the devil actually had come to earth and given him these verses and that they weren't actually from God. That basically is what the controversy is around. He wrote about these verses, the story in the book, The Satanic Verses, and it caused a gigantic controversy in the Muslim world. So for those of you who weren't alive at this time or don't remember, we're going to talk about how big of a controversy we are actually talking about. So Salman Rushdie was born in India. He lived in Britain where he published his book. But this was 1988, so this was 2 years before I was born. And by 1989, the Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa on his followers to kill anyone involved in the book's publication. So a fatwa is basically like a religious decree that it's okay to murder somebody. and the leader of Iran at the time issued one against Salman Rushdie. This is a huge deal. We're going to go through a little bit of a timeline here of violence that took place because of a book, mind you. This is because of the publication of a book that all these people died, and we're going to go through that. The February 12th, 1989, 6 people are killed and 100 are injured when 10,000 people attacked the American Cultural Center in Islamabad, Pakistan, protesting Rushdie and his book. February 13th, 1989, 1 person is killed and 100 injured when anti-Rushdie riots in I'm not sure what the name of the city is, Srinagar, which is outside of Kashmir, or in the Kashmir region of India. February 24th, 1989, 12 people die and 40 are wounded when a large anti-Rushdie riot in Bombay, India, starts to cause considerable property damage, and the police have to open fire on the crowd. February 28th, 1989, bookstores, including Cody's and Walden Books, are firebombed for selling the novel. In 1989 as well, there's a firebombing of the Riverdale Press. The offices of the Riverdale Press were firebombed and destroyed and the 911 caller said the bombing was in retaliation to an editorial defending the right to read the novel and criticizing stores that had stopped selling it. August 1989, a man using the alias Mustafa Muhammad Meza accidentally blows himself up along with two floors of the Central London Hotel when he was preparing a bomb that was going to be used to kill Salman Rushdie. 1990, there are 5 bombings of bookstores in England that were selling the novel. July 1991, Hitoshi Igarashi, I think is how his last name is pronounced, who was the novel's Japanese translator, is stabbed to death, and Ettore Caprilio, the Italian translator, is seriously wounded in 2 separate attacks. July 1993, 37 Turkish citizens are killed when a conference in Silvis, Turkey, is burnt to the ground by a mob of radical Islamists. The conference had a participant named Aziz Nesin, who had announced that he was going to attempt to get the book to be translated into Turkish, and that is why the conference itself was attacked. October 1993, the novel's Norwegian publisher, William Nygaard, is shot and seriously injured. Now, those are just some. There are more attacks that took place around this book, but those are people killed, injured, and you're talking dozens of people who were murdered over a book, and hundreds who were injured because of a book. The Iran's government has tried to distance itself from the fatwa since that time. Since 1998, it sounds like they have tried to pull back a little bit. But as recently as 2012, a semi-official Iran religious foundation raised a bounty for Rushdie of $3.3 million for his head. And in recent years, the Khomeini's successor, Ayatollah Khamenei, has stated that his support for the fatwa still is on the table. And even as recently as 2019, the Twitter account that belongs to the Ayatollah was banned for calling for a death threat against Rushdie. So this, it's not gone away, obviously. He was just attacked yesterday. The fatwa is still on the table. No one from Iran has ever denounced it. Iran, by the way, that we are currently trying, the Biden administration is currently trying to foster a deal with, they have had 3 high-profile assassination attempts in the last month. And we're just supposed to, ignore the fact that they're sponsoring global terrorism at a scale that we can't comprehend? John Bolton was just targeted for assassination. They just broke up that one. There's an Iranian feminist who lives here in the United States who they just arrested, some guy who showed up at her doorstep with an AK-47 who it appears to be was funded by the Iranian National Guard. And then you have this attack on Salman Rushdie. Now, the perpetrator of that hasn't been tied directly to Iran in any way, but this is obviously, the police haven't released the motive, but this is obviously, we know the motivation. There's no doubt in my mind that this is not some random crazy person attacking Salman Rushdie. This is someone who's motivated by ideology and possibly compelled by the idea that they're going to get $3 million. So let's not pretend Iran is a good actor on the world stage. They are not. This is terrible, and they are directly to blame for somebody attacking a person like Salman Rushdie. The publication of the Satanic Verses was the first real test of Western values that has come in the modern time. And what I mean by that is it was a unique problem that we weren't aware even existed. And it's this problem that as the West has liberalized, so we here in the West, and when I say the West, I mean places like the U.S., Canada, Western Europe, and there are other countries included as well. You could say Japan is a westernized country in a lot of ways. Or South Korea is a westernized country in a lot of ways. It actually doesn't mean geographically the West. It means places that have embraced Western liberalism. So when we say the West, what we mean is cultures that we live in right now, like the United States, where there is an emphasis on freedom of speech and bodily autonomy. So just to clarify some terms we're going to be using. This was the first test of Western values because there was a problem brewing that we did not know existed at the time in the late 80s. And it was the problem of the culture in a lot of Islamic countries colliding with the West in a way we weren't prepared for. So in the West, we champion the ideas of freedom of expression. And we were not prepared for people who don't put that as a fundamental value and not only don't care about freedom of speech, but actively work against it and will kill you if you say the wrong thing. That was something we weren't prepared for in the West because we have grown up in a culture of freedom of speech, and we think that everyone in the world just identifies this as a value worth having. And it is not true, and we're seeing that here in the West now as the West sort of eats itself with what we would call the regressive left or the illiberal left, where they don't care about freedom of speech anymore. But we weren't prepared for it in the 80s when it came to the clash of cultures with the Middle East. And it's a problem that a lot of progressives on the left have a hard time dealing with, which is the fact that you can't be so liberal that you accept illiberal values. So the West has to stand up for the culture, which is freedom of speech, bodily autonomy. And it's hard for progressives to do that because there are some people who believe that certain cultures aren't better than other cultures. I disagree with that sentiment entirely. I think it's entirely possible to pick out cultures that are better than other cultures. Now, every culture has something good about it, something redeeming, but to say that the United States, the culture in the United States, is better than the culture of North Korea, by any measure you could find, that is true. Nobody in their right mind, if given options, is going to pick to live in North Korea if they are aware of what the world has to offer. That should not be a controversial statement, but there are some people who say you really can't pick that because all you're doing is basing it on subjective values that you held because you grew up in the West. These people are morons. That's just not true. Anyone with half a brain will know this. The West has a problem of standing up for itself. There's a reason why places like the United States, Britain, France, Canada to a lesser extent, why these places have flourished in the world and other places have fallen behind. And it is because of our ability to allow people freedom of expression, bodily autonomy. These are the two most fundamental things. The idea being that you can live your life, and this amount of freedom that you're given in a culture makes the culture better. This is just the way that it works in the world. It's just the way that it is. And the West has a hard time standing up for that. So you'll get people on the progressive left who say things like, oh, all cultures are equal. Meanwhile, we look at Afghanistan and you say, well, do you think it would be better if it looked like the United States, or is it better under control of the Taliban? The treatment of women and girls, the treatment of gays, the treatment of apostates, which is what they call Salman Rushdie. And an apostate being somebody who is Muslim and then renounces the faith. Or you can be an apostate of any religion, but the word apostate in this context is someone who is Muslim and then renounces the faith. These people are sentenced to death. Salman Rushdie is an apostate. He's sentenced to death. Ayaan Hirsi Ali is an apostate. She is sentenced to death if she were to go into one of these countries. And so women, gays, other minorities, other religions, apostates, these people are treated terribly in a lot of the Muslim world. And liberals in the West have a hard time acknowledging that fact, that Western countries treat people better, and that it's standing up for them, the people who actually need help in the West, is a good thing. Anyway, we're getting a little sidetracked here. Freedom of speech is important. That's what Salman Rushdie symbolizes. The West failed in defending him adequately, in my opinion. We should have stood up in the late 80s, in the early 90s, and said, if you want to act like this, you don't get to be a part of the Western world. You don't get to deal with us. As long as Iran has a fatwa issued against a writer, an author, a man who never committed violence in his life, as long as they do that, you don't get to associate with us, because you can't act like adults. You're going to meet words with violence. This is what happens, by the way, when you say words are violence. When you say words are violence, which is a nonsensical phrase, when you say words are violence, then you meet words with violence. That's the way this works. That's what the Islamic extremists did in the late 80s, early 90s, and today. Let's not forget about Charlie Hebdo and all the other times that we have had attacks against Western thinkers. When you say words are violence, you meet words with violence. It's a terrible thing that you're now seeing on the left. People's feelings can be hurt. You actually can't say anything important without risking offending someone. Because if you're going to censor yourself for words because of an offense that you might give to a person, you have to think of it like this. Imagine that I want to get into a room with 100 people and I want to say something. When am I not allowed to say it? If it's offensive to 10 people? All right, if I go into a room and I offend 10% of the people with a speech I give, am I not allowed to say it? What if I offend one person? What if it's a room of 1,000 people and I offend one person? Where do you draw the line at what offense is acceptable and what isn't? I think the Overton window needs to be as broad as possible. I think we need to be able to say what we want to say in as broad a context as possible, because bad words can be defeated with good words. They can't be defeated with violence. This is not going to work. It's never worked. Salman Rushdie is just a symbol, and it's a symbol that we failed. When I saw him talk here in St. Louis, I always thought it was amazing that he no longer travels with a lot of security, because there's been threats on his life for 33 years. And I guess at a certain point, you just have to say you're going to live your life. But it is sad to see that this man who's 75 years old now be attacked like this, and we didn't do enough. We didn't do enough to refute these threats when they came up, and now we're paying the price for it 30 years later. The West has to stand up for its values. We have to stand up for freedom of speech. We have to say it is important, and we're not going to play with other countries that don't support it. We're not going to do that. And unfortunately, right now, the West is bargaining from a position of weakness. We don't have the moral backbone to do what needs to be done, which is to walk away from Iran and make their lives hell for this. This is their fault. This is that country's fault. And right now we're trying to make a deal with them and pretend that they're good people. There are plenty of people in Iran who are great, wonderful people who just want to live their lives. But the government of that country is terrible. Every single one of them. I don't care who it is. Everyone in the government of Iran is a bad actor at this point. The people, this is an important distinction, the people of Iran, we can't say that about. There are a lot of people in Iran who are working, who are heroes, who are trying to change the system. But the government itself is evil. They just are. It's the way it is. And we shouldn't allow ourselves as the West to compromise our values to make deals with bad people. And we should have done this in the late 80s, early 90s. We should say, you don't get to behave this way and get benefits from our country. You don't get to associate with us. You don't get to sit at the adult table if you act like a child. If you're going to throw your food around and cry because someone wrote a book you don't like, you don't get to come and you don't get to hang out with us. It's just not the way it's going to work. We won't do that, though. We're not going to do that. You've already seen the Biden administration trying to walk back the culpability of Iran in this situation. But it is their fault. It's the Ayatollah's fault. It's the leader of Iran, the supreme leader of Iran's fault. That fatwa should have been disavowed. It never has been. 33 years, a bounty has been placed on the life of Salman Rushdie. And we just saw somebody motivated by hate try and claim it. Anyway, we wish him a speedy recovery, and everything hopefully will be fine. 75 years old it's not easy to go into surgery and come out okay. So we're just going to leave our good thoughts with Salman Rushdie, and we're going to make a book recommendation of the day today. We haven't done this in a while. But if you've never read it, if you've never read it, The Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie, go ahead, pick up a copy. Now's a good time to go buy one, show your support. Refute this ideology that is cancerous to the world. You never meet words with violence. You meet words with better words. And if you think that the response to someone saying something hurtful is to go up and stab them, then you're a bad person. That's just the way it is. You are not a freedom fighter. You are not a person standing up to fascism. You are a violent asshole. That's just the way it is. You are a bad person. And we're going to leave it there for the day. I hope everybody knows that my main goal with this show is to promote good ideas. I criticize bad ideas a lot, but it really is to promote good ideas. Freedom of speech is the most important thing that we have. You have to be able to say what's on your mind, and you have to be allowed to do it. People are going to make mistakes. They're going to say the wrong things. Some people are going to be offensive. You have to accept speech you don't like, because if you try to ban speech that you don't like because you find it offensive, then you miss the entire point of what freedom of speech is about. Freedom of speech is the right to offend. It's not nice. People should be nice if they can be. But you have to risk someone saying something that you don't agree with. Otherwise, you don't believe in freedom of speech. Anyway, we're going to leave it there for the day. I'm Tyler Chrestman, and I will catch you guys on the next episode.